Salutations, respected viewers. This is a video on how to write an essay. So, an essay, it's an attempt. That's its derivation in French. It's an attempt to answer a question and not simply a straightforward factual question about what's true or what's false. Obviously, essays are written in the humanities generally, history, literature, politics, geography, things like that, classical civilization, and spills over into science subjects. In medicine, people even write essays. Right. There's usually no right or wrong answer to an essay, and the important thing is to be persuasive and to use evidence to formulate a case. So it'll start off with a question, and that's the one you've got to answer. Now, essays, they can be informative, they can be argumentative, they can be a bit of both. Well, if we were to take ones which are like debating topics, like should the death penalty be abolished, that'd be one you'd have to argue for or not. Or it could be something like, what was the main reason for the Bolshevik Revolution? Something like that. So they're along those lines. Obviously, they'd be written in formal English. This has got to be academic English, so avoiding slang words. If you're quoting something in literature which is in slang, then all right, you could use those informal words, making very sure to put them in quotation marks. So always attribute quotations. Likewise, if you are paraphrasing something, so not using those precise words, then likewise you should attribute it. Say who said it or which book did it come from. So don't pretend somebody else's word is your own. And there's no copyright on ideas. If somebody else says to you that the death penalty is wonderful, you're allowed to say that you think it's a good thing. But you can actually get more credit for attributing it, for saying there's, as John Stuart Mill argued in favour of it, things like that. So you might have to name drop a few intellectuals. So when I say formal English, I mean you'd have to write the word father. You shouldn't say dad, because that's informal. Not using contractions like isn't. Would you write is not? You wouldn't use words which are very general and a bit sloppy like get. Well, do we mean this in the sense of obtain or understand or arrive? What does get mean? You'd have to be more exact. So precision, really, that's the key word to essays. So you always want to be proving what you're saying is true by using quotations, as I've mentioned, using statistics where you know them. Sometimes you'd have to give an approximate number, like if you're saying William of Orange landed at Torbay, and saying a big army, a huge army, a gargantuan army, something like that is not very helpful. If you said it's estimated to be 20,000 strong, that'd be some valuable information. Even if the real figure was 18,000 or 23,000, the estimate is more useful than saying it was large. So the names of people who were important in history or whatever it is you're writing about, the names of organizations, the titles of books. If you use abbreviations, then actually saying what they stand for. NHS, but first of all you put National Health Service, then brackets NHS, there and after NHS. The examiner can't assume that you understand things. Occasionally you have to treat the examiner like an idiot. Okay, you have to prove that you know what you're talking about. The names of events, things like that, dates. So always being as exact as possible. So essays, well, it could be as little as 4 paragraphs. If it's shorter than 4 paragraphs, it's not really an essay. So what would you have? The 4 paragraphs would probably be the introduction, antithesis, thesis, and then conclusion. I would begin with the antithesis first. Some people have the thesis before the antithesis. So I'll say it again. Introduction, antithesis, thesis, and conclusion. So in the introduction, you might be interrogating the question, and you'd be defining your terms. So what about the should the death penalty be abolished? Well, you'd say the death penalty is when someone is sentenced to death by a court for having committed a crime, and that person is judicially executed. So not talking about killing people in combat, we're not talking about murder, but that we're talking about judicial capital punishment, things like that. Or if it was, what was the main reason for the October Revolution? You have to say, well, the October Revolution is something which took place in Russia in 1917 when the Bolsheviks, brackets, communists, seized power. So a bit of defining your terms, a little bit of giving background, and giving some hint of what your overall answer is going to be. Now, the antithesis is the argument that you don't agree with and probably a little bit weaker, but you're a broad-minded person and you can express an argument you disagree with, the better to demolish it and say, well, there's this point of view, and some people say this, and then having done that, come on to your thesis where you say, and it's wrong, and here's why, this is more persuasive. Last of all, moving on to the conclusion. And the conclusion must crucially include the word conclusion. So it could even begin with the words in conclusion, ... or this essay concludes, blah, blah, blah. Incidentally, the essay can speak. In the opinion of this essay, the conclusion of this essay, things like that. So it's more scholarly not to use the first person. I believe, I think, in my opinion, it appears to me, things like that. People do this, especially more recently, but traditionally that was considered poor form. In your conclusion, you might even reword the question into an answer. So the one about why did the October Revolution occur, what was the main reason for it, you say, therefore this essay concludes that the main reason for the October Revolution was the continuance of the First World War, or something like that. Or to come back to the death penalty example, in conclusion, this essay believes that the death penalty must be abolished because it's barbaric. You might have a reservation in there because these things are seldom clear-cut. To go back to the October Revolution, looking for the main reason, not the only reason. And I said, well, there's several possible reasons. We've got to choose which is the most important one. So evaluate them. Some are fairly important, some are very unimportant. And let's say we believe it was mainly the continuation of the First World War. However, food shortages were also significant. But the thing about the food shortages is they're partly occasioned by the First World War. I'll come back to the death penalty one. In conclusion, this essay believes that the death penalty ought to be abolished. However, it would allow very rare exceptions. That would be a reservation. Now, I might have one reservation in your conclusion. I wouldn't have two or more because it gets confusing. It could be like this. The death penalty should be abolished. However, there should be exceptions. However, not many exceptions. However, accept the exceptions to the exceptions, because the examiner is perplexed. So ideally, your writing would be lucid and someone would never have to reread the essay because they'd get it first time. And using some fairly long, fairly complex sentences, but not over long, not so someone loses the thread of your thoughts. Things should settle on the mind easily. What else? So an essay could be as little as 16 sentences if you're in middle of secondary school, as in 4 paragraphs, about 4 sentences per paragraph, 16 sentences overall. And now, as you get better, you'll be writing longer ones. Your antithesis might take 2 paragraphs, and your thesis might take 2 paragraphs. Therefore, the whole thing might be 6 paragraphs. And each paragraph might come to be 5 sentences, not 4 sentences. That's a total of 30 sentences, and getting longer and longer. And a sentence roughly 10 words, and then sentences getting closer to 20 words, and so on. So essays could be tens of thousands of words. There's no limit to it, but obviously in school, especially with the clock ticking in an exam, you've got to be realistic about it. So it's a good idea to plan your essays. So the very simple essays I'm talking about will be roughly 150 words. And you might write your plan, which would be something like 10 words. You know, could be a very brief version of the sentence and a couple of words about each paragraph, and that's that, just to jog your memory, just so you do it in the right order and you make sure you didn't forget anything. If you're handwriting it, you could write it on alternate lines, especially in exams, and then come back and add something in at the end if you realise it slipped your mind first time. Or indeed, if you misspelt something, you cross it out and tidily write it above. Things like that. So that is how to write an essay. So antithesis or antithesis, you can pronounce it either way. That's the argument you don't think is so convincing, but you ought to articulate it nonetheless. And this is roughly the method that people use for writing essays at any level, and they can go all the way up to the highest academic level. So please post your comments and questions below.